Otherwise, people will go to great discomfort in order not to break Shabbat. If you're traveling and you're expecting to get someplace, let's say by Friday morning at noon, by Friday at 10 a.m. or noon on Friday, but all of a sudden the thing is delayed, all of a sudden you're stuck in the airport, and then a plane becomes available on Friday night at 10:30, you don't get on that plane. You find a comfortable place on the airport floor, and you wind up being uncomfortable for the night. Now, other people have different approaches. Please understand, wherever there are two Jews, there are three opinions. And sometimes the things that people will tell you that they do publicly may not be what they do privately. Okay? We're like that. People are like that in general. And so recognize that there is a certain expectation. I mentioned these social media influences, these Orthodox Jewish families that are very attractive families. They have wonderful smiles. They're just very friendly. They'll often, in one of the recent episodes, they're like 3-minute episodes. It shows the family running to get someplace before sundown because they didn't want to violate Shabbat. And they were very, very serious about that. You know, they just had the cameras like bouncing around as they try to head to find this in some exotic location. They travel the world, and they are very sincere. They were fearful that they would have to spend the night out in the open or in their car, because at a certain point on Friday, they would have had to turn the car off and be stuck in the car. Again, different people have different levels of observance, but that would be typical. And so in your outline, if you can turn back to there, we say here basically the Shabbat was to be a day of rest, not corporate worship. However, once the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, in the diaspora is the dispersion of the Jewish people after the year 70 AD. Once the temple was destroyed, in the diaspora it became both a day of rest and a day of worship assembly. And so to this day, one of the main services of the week is the Shabbat morning service. And the Shabbat morning service would typically be a full Torah service, where the Torah would be taken out. This is a large Torah on wooden rollers. The Torah scroll that we have here at the school is, yes, a genuine Torah scroll, but it's not on rollers. It was rescued from the Holocaust and remained that way for years. One day we might want to put it on rollers, but that's the way it's done typically in the synagogue. And so there will be thousands of additional rabbinic rules added to the biblical commandments, and they will have a full Sabbath service. And the Sabbath service is typically going to last several hours. There are liturgical readings. There is a cycle of readings from the Torah, a cycle of readings from what is called the Haftarah. The Haftarah is a portion from the Nevi'im, the prophets, or the Ketuvim, the writings, or the prophets or writings that have some connection thematically with the Torah portion. So very simply put, in order to understand Shabbat, just understand the Sabbath service in the synagogue. Now, I already said to you, the Sabbath is primarily a home holiday. It's not a synagogue holiday. That's true. So why am I talking about the synagogue? Because some people who are truly religious, which is all of Orthodox Jews, in addition to starting the Sabbath at home, the Sabbath has always started on Friday night by the woman of the house. One of the things that is absolutely true, it sounds like public relations talk. It sounds like publicity, but I guarantee you it's true. A Jewish home is far more dependent upon the actions of the mother than the actions of the father. Jewish women are not bound by all of the commandments that say You should do this, do that. Those commandments are incumbent upon men. They must do all of those commandments. Everyone, however, is bound by the negative commandments. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do the other thing. However, in order to pass on a sense of Jewish identity, if they only see dad going off by himself to shul, to synagogue, the sense of ethnic Jewish identity is not going to be passed on. But when they grow up in a Jewish home, which is maintained by a Jewish woman, and that woman makes a Shabbat table, that becomes a very deep and indelible memory on the minds of young people. And they grow up going to this sort of service. Their main service to attend is in the home. Again, women and girls, while certainly encouraged to attend synagogue, are oftentimes not there, even in the most orthodox of families. Yes, there is a women's section, there's a women's gallery in some Hasidic shuls, it's a second floor, there may be even curtains. In smaller, I'm using the word shul, by the way, it's the Yiddish word for basically a house of worship, house of study. It's literally the German word for school. And so in a smaller shul, there will be a metzia, a curtain down the middle aisle. If you have a congregation with two aisles, and there's on each side, then one down the middle, they're going to have a curtain, and they're going to have two passages. The whole idea there is to, number one, is to maintain a physical separation. In traditional Orthodox Judaism, there is not supposed to be any physical touching or contact between men and women who are not in their immediate families. Okay, so anyone outside of your mom, your sisters, your daughter, you cannot have any physical touching. And so to facilitate that, there is this curtain down the middle of the synagogue, or the women's gallery is in the upper portion there. There have been movies. There was a movie a few years ago, The Women's Gallery, and it had to do with some drama that was happening in the women's gallery as they watched the men. A second, and this is going to seem a little silly, I'm almost feeling that it's silly even to say it, but the whole idea is that they don't want the men to be distracted during the worship. And so if they're seeing the women there, the thoughts of a few people may wander over to the women's section. Who's wearing what, all this sort of thing. And so there is not supposed to be a line of sight. You're supposed to have that metzia up to at least 6 feet. And so all of these happen on the day of Shabbat, but as I started out saying, the primary responsibility of an Orthodox Jewish woman is not to go to synagogue on Shabbat, but to make a home on Shabbat that is suitable for Shabbat being a memorable occasion. What's done in the home to celebrate Shabbat is more important than what's done in the synagogue. And they will to a person, they will all say that sort of thing. And so just to go back to the chronology of Shabbat, they're lighting the candles. The lighting is done 18 minutes before sundown. They'll give you a few minutes one way or the other leeway, but you light the candles. A married woman will light 2 candles, just like the one you see in the left-hand illustration. Here's just a short public service announcement. I was contacted by someone who was here the first week, and that person said, "What in the world are they doing having a menorah, the holder for the Shabbat candles in the form of a menorah? Why were they using a menorah, Hanukkah menorah, for the candles?" And what this person doesn't remember is that early on in this camp, when she was first here years ago, that same menorah was still in use. If we use that menorah because we have freedom in these cultural matters, the idea of having 2 candles that are separate is fine, but it's not mandated in Scripture. Where in Scripture does it tell you that we have to light 2 candles? Don't bother searching, it ain't there. How do the rabbis come up with it? they go to an extrapolation. They look at the whole idea of lights and themes, and there are people who might be able to tell you more about the rationale behind having two candles. But there are many traditions that came about within the Jewish community that we don't have to be concerned, we don't have to be scared of. Here's a perfect example we'll talk about in a few days. When Passover is first given in the book of Exodus, there are only 3 items that are mandated for Passover on the table: the unleavened bread, the bitter herb, and the unleavened bread. The Passover lamb, the bitter herb, and the unleavened bread, the matzah. Those are the only 3 things that are mandated in that year 1250, 1300 BC. Fast forward 1300 years, and there's Messiah Jesus celebrating the Last Supper. He is now officiating over a Passover that, yes, it has the Passover lamb, just as they've always have. It has the bitter herb, just like they always had. And it has, of course, the unleavened bread, the matzah. But it also has 4 cups of wine. It also has the sort of the mixture that is going to be used to represent the mortar that was used to make the bricks, the charoset mixture. So now you see Jesus officiating over the fruit of the vine. It's not in the text of the Torah. It was developed within the Jewish community, but Messiah Yeshua is, in essence, and excuse this expression, he's giving his stamp of approval, in essence, to these additions to the text. These were not additions that were against the text. They were illustrative things. For instance, the charoset, the apple mixture with the apples, nuts, and honey, that is there to illustrate the mortar that was used to make the bricks. Remember when Moses went to Pharaoh, you can visualize the scene. There's Charlton Heston going to Yul Brynner, right? For those of you who are old enough to know the movie The Ten Commandments, that was the scene, and he's complaining to Yul Brynner, to Pharaoh. And he's saying, this is really tough work. My people are not happy. And Pharaoh says, you're complaining to me? Now you guys are going to make bricks without straw. And it's very difficult to make bricks without straw. You need the straw to hold them together. And so to retell that part of the narrative, especially to the children who are at the Pesach table, at the table for Passover, you want to do something vivid in a sort of a demonstration that will help them remember that. And that's what we'll talk about in a few days. We're going to demonstrate that. And so we have Messiah Jesus giving full participation to Jewish rituals that developed after the close of the biblical canon. That is a very powerful argument, and it's an argument that, again, excuse the expression, spits in the face of the anti-Semites who say, the Jews have the synagogue of Satan, and we have to fully oppose the Jews. Wait a second. Jesus grew up in one of those synagogues. Jesus worshiped in those synagogues. Even after he proclaimed himself to be the Messiah, he kept going back to those synagogues because he said in the book of John, chapter 4, salvation is of the Jews. And he kept offering it to them until finally the leaders said, we have no king but Caesar. And so there are rituals in the Jewish community which, as New Testament believers, under grace, we don't have to have any fear about adding to the Passover. And I say this because occasionally you come across believers who are very legalistic as they tell us that we have to keep the Mosaic law. And then they get a little crazier because they only want to keep that which is precisely in Scripture. And even when they find it impossible, they cut themselves slack, they make excuses, and they wind up cherry-picking the things that they want to observe. My friends, we are not under Mosaic law. We're under grace. It was for grace. It was for liberty that Messiah has set us free. Galatians chapter 5, verse 1. There are many other courses at the school over the course of the 5-year curriculum that take that concept apart, explain it, turn it around every which way, and show that we are under grace and not under law. There are a dozen passages that clearly say we are not under law, we are under grace. I became, as a Judean to the Judeans, is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9, that I might win the Judeans. To the one under law, Paul says, I became as under law, though I am not under the law, in order to win those who are under the law. So what that verse tells you is we have freedom in these other cultural matters, and we shouldn't be judged in those cultural matters. Neither should we kind of fear them as kind of the boogeyman, that we have to stay away, that somehow God would be displeased. Jesus himself freely participated in Jewish customs and rituals that were developed by the rabbis. But when we say that, you have to understand that amongst the teachers in that intertestamental period, there were a number who were believers. Again, Messiah had not yet come. Consider the story of Simeon and Anna. There, Miriam and Joseph are bringing the baby Yeshua to the temple, Luke chapter 2. And they're bringing the baby to the temple, and the scripture says that there was a woman by the name of Anna, and she took the baby and prophesied. And then Simeon, they got a few more steps, and Simeon was there. And of course, he takes the baby into his arms, and he looks up to heaven, because the scripture says it had been revealed to him that he would not die until he had seen the Lord's Messiah. So he takes the baby into his arms, a very emotional scene, and he says, Lord, now let thy servant depart in peace. I'm ready to go, because my eyes have seen, and then he uses the Hebrew word, the single word, Yeshua Techa. My eyes have seen thy Yeshua. In order to say, my eyes have seen thy salvation, which is what your text says, 2 words in English, thy salvation, it's only 1 word in Hebrew. It's the word Yeshua Techa. My eyes have seen thy Yeshua. It's the name of the baby. A light to enlighten the Gentiles and a glory unto thy people Israel. And so Shabbat becomes for the Jewish people a day of rest, a day of remembering the work of God, and for those of us who are believers, irregardless of whether you're coming from a Gentile or Jewish background, Shabbat is a day that we can honor, but as Messiah himself said, Shabbat was made for man, not man for Shabbat. The Sabbath was made for mankind to serve us. We were not made to serve the Sabbath. It's a warning not to get involved with all of the additional rules and regulations that can be imposed by men. The additional rules and regulations can be imposed by Jewish rabbis, or they can be imposed by fundamentalists who think they're doing the will of God. And so it was for freedom that Messiah has set us free. So that will then go forward to a whole host of practices and things that we'll encounter. Is it okay for a Jewish believer or a Gentile believer to go into the home of an Orthodox Jewish person to participate in Shabbat? Go and eat well. Make sure you have a way to get home. And here's why. Because you're there to say that there is a great deal of overlap. This is not 2 separate peoples, but there is a great deal of overlap. So let's discuss the issue. Is it okay for a believer, Jewish or Gentile, to take a kippah and put it on their head and to do this as a symbol of solidarity with the Jewish people? Go right ahead. As long as if you happen to be from a non-Jewish background, please be clear, and if anyone asks you, don't suddenly say, oh, I think my grandfather's name was actually Rabinowitz, but he changed it to Robbins or something. If you don't know that for sure, don't say it. There's a lot of people walking around Messianic conferences who grew up in solidly, Protestant homes who've gotten the Jewish bug. They want to be Jewish. They're the Jewish wannabes. I'm flattered, but you're saying that God made a mistake. I believe that very sincerely. It hurts my heart when I see Gentile believers who are having an identity crisis, who somehow believe that there is some additional merit to being a target for persecution. Please understand that you've not experienced all the things that those of us who grew up in the Jewish community experience, and so there actually will be some resentment. A person who was O'Malley one day, and the next day they're Ottenstein, you parade yourself as a Jew, and you've gone through nothing that the Jewish people have experienced. You've not experienced any of the persecution. You don't understand the angst that sometimes accompanies that. It's like Tevye the milkman said, I know we're the chosen people, but why don't you choose someone else sometime? Because he had experienced horrible persecution. God is no respecter of persons. The chosen person was chosen to accomplish a task. It doesn't make that person any better or any worse than anyone in the room. The Jewish people were chosen to accomplish a task, two tasks that were very important. Jewish people were chosen to work. The two things that they needed to work at was to give the world the scriptures and to give the world the Messiah. We succeeded in giving the world the scriptures, and we succeeded, B'ezrat Hashem, with the help of God, in giving the world the Messiah. However, we had a third assignment that we failed, and that third assignment was to be or legoyim, or leolam. We were supposed to be a light to the Gentile nations. We were supposed to be or legoyim, and in that we miserably failed. Instead of being a light to enlighten the Gentile nations with the things of the God of Israel, we most often wound up participating with the foolishness of pagan worship. And so ultimately God sent the perfect servant. We were supposed to serve, we were sleeping on the job. And so the perfect servant came in the form of Yeshua the Messiah. So these are certain things. Just one last thing to entertain you, to show you how important Shabbat is. I almost forgot it, but it's staring me in the face. In the Brooklyn Standard Union newspaper of May 29th, 1916, this is worth taking an additional 2 minutes for, it says, fine and jail sentence for Sunday violation. In New York City, back in 1916, it was against the law to open up on Sunday. Doctors could answer emergency calls on Sunday, but you couldn't open a retail store. But the problem was there's this guy who's mentioned here. His name is Isaac Baleston. He's my great uncle, and he's also a jailbird. True confessions. We can edit this out, maybe. Isaac Baleston, a delicatessen owner. He ran a Jewish deli. He's not allowed to open on the Sabbath. This shows you how important Sabbath is. So Isaac Baleston, a delicatessen dealer of 545 Fifth Avenue in Brooklyn, was fined $10 and sent to city prison for 5 days by Magistrate Geismar, German guy, in Fifth Avenue Court today for violating the Sunday closing law on May 21st. Baleston was accused as a second offender. And so there are the details. I was able to find this. In other words, my grandfather ran a Jewish deli. Whether it was strictly kosher, I don't know, but it was a Jewish deli. You can't open a deli on Saturday because it's the Sabbath. People expect them to be closed. That's 100 years ago. Today, most of the Jewish delis are open on Saturday. And so it shows you that he was willing to go to jail. It did him no good to open on Saturday because he would have been blacklisted by the community. They would have said, you're a Sabbath offender, and so we're not going to shop